Usually when we discuss a medical diagnosis, right, there's this inherent expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It operates almost like engineering.
Yeah.
If you fracture a bone, the X-ray shows that jagged white line. The doctor points to the screen, and the path forward is dictated by hard, undeniable evidence.
Right. It's all very objective.
Exactly. But imagine just for a second a scenario that runs completely counter to that logic. Imagine walking into a specialist's office. You sit on the exam table, and the doctor just looks at you.
Just looks at you.
Yeah, just looks. They don't take your blood pressure. They don't check your resting heart rate. They don't draw blood. They simply glance at your posture and say, I have a feeling you need this heavy-duty medication. Go ahead and start taking it.
I mean, that sounds like a joke, but it perfectly illustrates professional malpractice. You would walk out of that office immediately.
You'd run out of that office.
Right. Because trusting a physician who operates on a subjective hunch without first establishing, the objective metrics of your physical health, it's unthinkable in modern medicine.
And yet when you step into the world of behavioral health, neurodevelopment, and specifically applied behavior analysis, there is this recurring temptation to fall into that exact same trap.
It happens all the time.
It does. What does an ABA program actually look like without accurate, relentless data collection? It looks exactly like that reckless doctor.
Yes, that is such a critical point.
Data in behavior analysis is not just, a pile of paperwork or the billing formality to satisfy insurance companies. It is the invisible thread connecting every single successful behavioral intervention. It's the vital signs of human behavior.
That framing is crucial for anyone stepping into this field. Because without data, we have absolutely no objective reality to base clinical decisions on.
We're just flying blind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are subject to our own biases, our exhaustion on any given Tuesday or our desperate hope that an intervention is actually working.
Right. And in a field dedicated to improving the lives of vulnerable populations, operating on subjective hope rather than objective reality is simply not an option.
No, it's not. It's actually unethical.
Which brings us to the mission for this deep dive. We are targeting the RBT 3rd edition task list, specifically focusing on section A.1, which is continuous measurement procedures.
So we're talking frequency, duration, latency, and interresponse time?
Right. So if you were an RBT candidate prepping for your board exam, or a newly minted technician, or even a practicing clinician looking to, calibrate your skills, you are in the right place.
This is the foundation of the job.
It really is. But before we get into the mathematical formulas and the textbook definitions, let's establish the gravity of the role. Because the BCBA, the Board Certified Behavior Analyst, they might sit in an office and design this elegant, scientifically sound intervention plan.
But they aren't the ones executing it.
No, they're not on the floor every minute.
No, they are relying entirely on the registered behavior technician. As an RBT, you are the foundation of the entire clinical apparatus. You are literally the sensory organs of the supervising BCBA.
Their eyes and ears on the ground.
Day in and day out. If your data is flawed, the BCBA's analysis will be flawed, which means the treatment will be flawed. The entire architecture of ABA rests on the assumption that the person holding the clipboard is capturing the objective reality of the session with total fidelity.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to test that assumption of total fidelity. When we talk about continuous measurement, the word continuous itself sounds incredibly demanding.
It does, yeah. It sounds like you can't blink.
Right. In a clinical context, my understanding is that you are required to capture every single instance of a target behavior during an observation period.
That is the definition, yes.
But let me challenge the realism of that for a second. If you're managing a client who is highly active, right, you're delivering reinforcement, you're blocking potential aggression, you are running discrete trials, how on earth are you supposed to catch every single instance of a behavior? It seems like a setup for failure.
Well, it is a setup for failure if you try to apply continuous measurement to the wrong type of behavior.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
That is where the science of measurement actually protects the technician. We do not use continuous measurement for everything. We only deploy it for what we call discrete behaviors.
Discrete behaviors. Meaning what, exactly?
A discrete behavior has a definitive, unambiguous onset and offset. It has a clear beginning and a clear end.
Give me a clinical profile where that actually applies in the real world.
Sure. Let's imagine a 7-year-old client. We'll call him Leo. Leo has a history of elopement, meaning he runs away from the instructional area.
Okay, very common scenario.
extremely common. Elopement is a perfect candidate for continuous measurement. The moment Leo's feet cross the threshold of the therapy room door, the behavior has started.
And when he comes back.
Right. The moment you gently guide him back across that threshold, the behavior has ended. Because that behavior requires a specific, observable sequence of events, and because it generally doesn't happen, 70 times a minute, you, as the observer, can reliably attend to it and count it.
I see the distinction. So the discrete nature of the behavior is what makes the continuous measurement viable.
Exactly.
But what happens when Leo's behavior doesn't have that clean start and stop? Like, what if Leo engages in rapid motor stereotypy, let's say, complex finger flicking right in front of his eyes?
Okay, yeah.
It happens incredibly fast.
Yeah.
Right? It stops for a fraction of a second, starts again, morphs into hand flapping, and then goes back to finger flicking.
If you try to use continuous measurement on rapid motor stereotypy, you will compromise the rest of your session, and your data will still be highly inaccurate.
Because you're just constantly pushing a button or making tally marks.
Exactly. High-rate behaviors, or behaviors that are incredibly fluid and continuous in nature, like rocking back and forth for 20 minutes where you can't clearly define where one rock ends and the next begins, those demand a completely different approach.
So what do you do then?
That is where a BCBA would assign a discontinuous measurement procedure, like whole interval or partial interval recording. But we're not covering those today because those rely on sampling rather than capturing every single instance.
Right. Let's stick with the idea of capturing the whole picture. I've always thought of continuous measurement as like a closed-circuit security camera.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, if a security camera is rolling 24/7 in a hallway, it captures absolutely every single person who walks through that frame. Nothing is missed.
Right.
Discontinuous measurement, on the other hand, is like a security guard who only looks at the hallway monitor for 10 seconds every 5 minutes.
Yes. They get a sample of who is in the hallway, but they miss a lot of the nuance. That is an excellent framework. And it highlights why continuous measurement is the gold standard when every single occurrence of a behavior is clinically significant.
Like severe behaviors.
Precisely. Consider severe self-injurious behavior. If a client engages in head striking, but it only happens once or twice a week, the security guard looking up every 5 minutes approach, the discontinuous sample, might completely miss those crucial instances.
Because it's so infrequent.
Right. When the stakes are high and the behavior is infrequent but severe, you need the continuous security camera. You have to capture every instance.
But I want to push back on the reality of the clinic floor again. Because, even with discrete behaviors, human error happens.
Of course it does.
Let's say I'm working with Leo. He is having a remarkably difficult day. He's engaging in proper destruction, throwing heavily weighted items, and I am in the middle of a crisis management protocol.
Safety is the priority there.
Right. My clipboard is across the room, the crisis passes, I get Leo regulated, and I finally fit down. I know I missed taking data for the last 15 minutes. Is there ever a clinical justification for me to sit there, mentally replay the last 15 minutes, and just sort of estimate that he threw about 12 items?
I am so glad you brought this up because it touches on the most critical ethical vulnerability for a new RBT.
It happens a lot, right?
All the time. But the answer is, unequivocally, absolutely no. You cannot backfill data. You cannot estimate. You cannot round up. In behavior analysis, estimating data from memory is considered data fraud.
Calling it fraud feels almost malicious, though.
Yeah.
I mean, most RBTs who do that aren't trying to deceive the BCBA. They're just overwhelmed and want to make sure the data sheet looks complete.
Oh, absolutely.
They feel like a blank space is a failure on their part.
You are touching on the psychology of the RBT, which is incredibly valid. It rarely comes from a place of malice. It usually comes from panic or a desire to appear competent to their supervisor.
Right, they want to do a good job.
But we have to separate the intent of the technician from the impact on the client. If you alter, omit, or backfill data, you are fundamentally corrupting the clinical decision-making process.
Let's trace the domino effect of that. If I estimate that Leo threw 12 items, and I put that on the graph, what actually happens next?
The BCBA logs in, looks at the graph, and sees a massive spike in property destruction.
And they react to that spike.
They might look at that data and decide, wow, the current intervention is failing. We need to implement a much more restrictive consequence procedure.
When maybe the crisis wasn't even that bad, relatively speaking.
Or Conversely, if you underestimated the behavior because you forgot how intense the crisis actually was, the BCBA might look at the data and think, great, the intervention is working, let's fade out our support.
Right, when Leo actually needs more support.
Exactly. So by trying to cover up a 15-minute gap in your own data collection, you could inadvertently subject a client to a more restrictive environment or strip away the support they desperately need.
That's terrifying, honestly.
It is. The BACB ethics code is uncompromising on data integrity for this exact reason. An empty graph, which includes a session note stating that data could not be collected during a specific time due to safety variables, that is truthful.
A blank space with an honest note is better than a guess.
Always. A fabricated graph is a lie that can psychologically or physically harm the client. Transparency must always override the desire for a perfect-looking data sheet.
That is a stark but necessary reality check.
Oh.
Okay, assuming we are operating with integrity and we are committed to capturing every discrete instance like that security camera, the most fundamental question we can ask about a behavior is simply, how many times did it happen?
Right, but count.
Which brings us to the concepts of frequency and rate. And I know these two are constantly conflated in the field.
They are the twin pillars of measurement that almost everyone trips over during their board exams.
Let's delineate them carefully because it's so important. If we look at the Cooper text, the foundational literature for our field, frequency is strictly defined as the raw count of occurrences, like a simple tally.
Yes, the terms count and frequency are used interchangeably in the Cooper text. It is just the raw number.
So no time attached to it at all.
None. If you were observing Leo and you make a tally mark every time he elopes from the table, and at the end of the session you have 7 tally marks, your frequency is 7.
That seems almost too simple.
Right.
Where is the clinical limitation there? Why isn't a raw count enough to make a behavioral decision?
Because a raw count exists in a vacuum. It lacks temporal context.
Temporal context, like time.
Yes. Let me pose a clinical scenario to illustrate this. Imagine a BCBA is reviewing the data for a client who engages in physical aggression.
Okay.
On Monday, the frequency of aggression was 10. On Wednesday, the frequency was 20. On Friday, the frequency was 30. If you were the BCBA looking only at the frequency, what is your immediate clinical conclusion?
Well, my conclusion is that the behavior is escalating rapidly. I mean, it doubled and then it tripled. The intervention is a catastrophic failure.
That is the logical conclusion based purely on frequency. But what if I add the temporal context? What if I tell you that Monday's session was 1 hour long, Wednesday's session was 2 hours long, and Friday's session was 3 hours long?
Oh, well, that completely changes the narrative.
Does it?
Yeah, because on Monday, it was 10 instances in 1 hour. On Wednesday, it was 20 instances in 2 hours, which is still exactly 10 instances per hour.
Right.
And Friday was 30 instances in 3 hours. So the behavior isn't escalating at all. It is perfectly stable at 10 instances per hour.
And that realization is exactly why the concept of rate was developed. Rate is frequency standardized per unit of time.
So count divided by time.
The formula is exactly that, count divided by time. By dividing the raw tally by the observation period, you strip away the illusion created by varying session lengths. You reveal the actual density of the behavior.
I want to make sure this is crystal clear for the listeners because it's a profound shift in how you look at data. I've often seen rate compared to driving a car.
The driving analogy is perfect.
All right, so frequency is just the total distance, the miles. Let's say you drove 120 miles. That's your count.
Okay.
But rate is your speedometer. It's your miles per hour. If you drove that 120 miles in 2 hours, your rate is 60 miles per hour.
Yes.
But if you drove that exact same 120 miles over the course of 10 hours, your rate is 12 miles per hour. The count of miles is identical, but the reality of the behavior, the speed, the intensity is entirely different.
That analogy holds up beautifully in the clinical space. I mean, a child hitting their head 50 times in a 10-hour day requires a very different clinical response than a child hitting their head 50 times in 5 minutes.
Oh, absolutely. The 5-minute scenario is a medical emergency.
Right. And this brings us to a critical precision note for RBTs on the floor, specifically a BCBAD precision note. You cannot calculate rate if you forget to write down the duration of your observation.
Meaning, if I just write down 15 head strikes on my data sheet, but I forget to log that my session started late and ended early, That data is effectively useless for rate calculations
It is entirely useless. You have the numerator, but you've lost the denominator.
because you don't know the time.
Right, you can never retroactively deduce the rate. This is why standardizing your observation times, or meticulously documenting the exact start and stop times of your sessions, is just as important as tallying the behavior itself.
Let's solidify this for the listeners prepping for an exam. Let's run a thought experiment structured like a board question.
Okay, let's do it.
So you are a BCBA reviewing baseline data on a student's spontaneous hand raising in a mainstream classroom. Method A reports the raw tally of hand raises per session. Method B reports the hand raises divided by the number of minutes the observer was in the room.
Okay, tally versus rate.
Right. You notice the observer's time in the room varied wildly. Sometimes they were there for 15 minutes, sometimes for 50 minutes. Which measurement method provides the most scientifically valid comparison across those baseline days?
The only scientifically valid choice is method B, which is rate. Anytime you are dealing with unequal observation periods, raw frequency will lie to you.
Because of those artificial peaks.
Right, it will create artificial peaks and valleys in your data that are purely an artifact of how long you watched, not how often the client actually engaged in the behavior. Rate standardizes the data, allowing you to compare a 15-minute sample directly to a 50-minute sample on equal footing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So we have the how many securely locked down. We count it and we divide it by time to get the true picture. But let's shift the paradigm entirely.
Okay.
Counting is highly effective for behaviors that happen in an instant, right? A thrown object, a slap desk, a vocal outburst. But what if the behavior itself is a marathon, not a sprint?
That changes the measurement system entirely.
Right, let's go back to our client, Leo. Leo doesn't just hit the desk. He drops to the floor and engages in a full-blown tantrum. If that tantrum lasts for 45 agonizing minutes, putting a single tally mark of 1 on a frequency sheet feels like a gross misrepresentation of the clinical reality.
It is a misrepresentation. It violates the core rule of measurement. You must measure the dimension of the behavior that is most clinically relevant.
And a tally mark doesn't tell you how exhausting that 45 minutes was.
Exactly. When a behavior is defined by its temporal extent, meaning how much time it physically takes up, counting its frequency is virtually useless. This is where we must utilize duration.
How does the Cooper text rigidly define duration?
Duration is the elapsed time from the onset of a single behavioral episode to the offset of that same episode.
The onset and offset. So knowing exactly when the behavior starts and stops is paramount.
It's everything.
But what if the behavior is messy? What if Leo's tantrum involves screaming, and then he stops screaming to catch his breath for, say, 10 seconds, and then he starts screaming again? Has the duration ended? Do I stop my timer?
This is where the BCBA's operational definition becomes your lifeline. A well-written behavior plan will define the onset and offset parameters specifically to prevent that kind of confusion.
So it takes the guesswork out of it.
Exactly. For instance, the plan might state, onset is defined as any vocalization above conversational volume, accompanied by dropping to the floor. Offset is defined as 3 consecutive minutes of calm body and neutral vocalizations.
Oh, I see. So that 10-second pause to catch his breath wouldn't trigger the offset because he hasn't met the 3-minute criteria for being calm.
Exactly. The timer keeps running. The duration is contiguous until the strict offset criteria are met.
Now, I know there are 2 distinct ways RBTs are asked to track this, right? Total duration and duration per occurrence.
Yes, 2 different subtypes.
If I am in a classroom setting and the teacher wants to know how much time a kindergarten student is spending in isolated, solitary play rather than engaging with peers, how would I track total duration?
Total duration is the cumulative sum of all the behavior's footprints throughout the observation period. So you start your digital stopwatch the moment the student goes to the corner to play alone.
Okay, timer is running.
After 5 minutes, they join a group. You hit stop on the stopwatch, but, and this is crucial, you do not reset it to 0.
You leave it at 5.
You hold it at 5 minutes. 20 minutes later, they drift back to the corner alone. You hit start again. The timer resumes from 5 minutes.
Oh, so it's just building a running total.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At the end of the 3-hour observation, your stopwatch reads 42 minutes. That 42 minutes is the total duration.
It gives you the aggregate mass of the behavior.
Yeah.
But I imagine that limits your analysis because you don't know if that 42 minutes was one giant block of isolation or 42 separate 1-minute instances.
You've just articulated the exact reason why we often prefer the second subtype, which is duration per occurrence.
How do the mechanics of duration per occurrence differ for the RBT taking the data? Like, practically speaking.
With duration per occurrence, you are measuring each discrete instance separately. Let's use the example of a student who frequently leaves their seat during instruction. Every time the student's glutes leave the chair, you start the stopwatch. When they sit back down, you stop it. You write down that specific time. Let's say it was 45 seconds.
Yeah.
Then you reset your stopwatch to 0. The next time they stand up, you time that new instance independently. Let's say it's 2 minutes.
So by resetting the timer, I'm building a ledger of individual events.
Yes. And duration per occurrence is vastly superior for detailed clinical analysis because it yields dual data points.
Because you get the count and the time?
You automatically get the frequency. You know they got out of their seats 6 times because you have 6 separate times written down on your sheet. And you know the length of each specific occurrence.
And you can always do the math later to get the total.
Exactly. You can always add them up later to find the total duration, but you cannot work backwards from total duration to find the individual instances.
Let's apply this to another exam-style thought experiment for our listeners. Let's say you are working with a family, and they are exhausted. Their child engages in severe tantrums every single evening.
That's incredibly taxing for a family.
It really is. So the BCBA introduces a new intervention. 2 weeks later, the parents are thrilled. They feel like they have their lives back. But when the BCBA looks at the frequency data collected by the RBT, it shows the child is still having one tantrum every single day.
So the frequency hasn't budged.
The frequency hasn't budged. If you only look to frequency, the intervention looks like a failure. But what if the measurement had been duration?
If the measurement had been duration, the graph would reflect the reality of the parent's relief. Before the intervention, that one daily tantrum might have lasted for 75 minutes.
A grueling, exhausting hour and 15 minutes.
Exactly. After the intervention, they are still having one tantrum a day, but the duration has dropped to 4 minutes.
That is a staggering clinical victory.
It is a life-changing victory for that family. But if the measurement system was misaligned with the critical dimension of the behavior, if the RBT was only instructed to tally the frequency, that massive clinical success would be completely invisible on the graph.
The BCBA would just see a flat line of one tantrum a day.
Right, and they might scrap an intervention that was actually working miracles simply because they were measuring the wrong temporal dimension.
Which perfectly transitions us into the more complex temporal dimensions. We have covered the count, so frequency and rate, and the extent, which is duration. But behavior analysis doesn't just care about the behavior itself, right? It cares profoundly about the empty space surrounding the behavior.
The temporal locus.
Temporal locus, meaning when a behavior occurs in time in relation to other events, the two primary measurements here are latency and end-response time, or IRT. Let's dissect latency first. I want to look at the neurological and environmental reality of latency. The strict definition is the elapsed time between the presentation of an antecedent stimulus, usually an instruction or a discriminative stimulus, an SD, and the initiation of a response.
The word initiation is the operational linchpin there.
Let's explore that. If I say to a client, write your name on the paper, the latency timer starts the millisecond I finish speaking.
Correct.
Now, let's say the client stares at the wall for 12 seconds, then picks up the pencil and takes 30 seconds to slowly write their name. When exactly does my latency timer stop?
It stops at the 12-second mark.
Not when they finish writing.
No.
Okay.
The exact moment they pick up the pencil, the response has been initiated. The latency period is over. The subsequent 30 seconds it takes them to write their name is the duration of the behavior, not the latency.
That's a great distinction.
What's fascinating here is that latency stops the second the behavior starts, whereas duration measures the behavior itself. Latency is exclusively the waiting period. It is the temporal gap between the environment making a demand and the organism beginning to respond.
Why does that gap exist, clinically speaking? I mean, if I give an instruction, why is there a 12-second latency?
It can be driven by a multitude of factors, which is why we measure it. High latency could indicate a neurological processing delay. The client simply needs more time to decode the auditory information of your instruction.
So they're just thinking about what you said.
Right. Alternatively, it could be a behavioral function, like a form of subtle non-compliance or task avoidance. If they delay starting the task for 12 seconds, they have successfully avoided the non-preferred demand for 12 seconds.
That makes a lot of sense. But can latency be too short? We always talk about reducing latency, getting kids to comply faster. But is there a clinical scenario where short latency is the actual pathology?
Absolutely. Think about impulsivity or reactive aggression. If a peer accidentally bumps into a client in the hallway and the client throws a punch with a latency of 0.2 seconds, that is a severe deficit in temporal locus.
Because they didn't even think.
The latency is so short that the client's frontal lobe has no time to process the context that it was an accident or to select a socially appropriate alternative behavior.
Wow, so the goal would be to slow them down.
In that case, yes, the clinical goal is actually to increase the latency. We want to build in a 3-second gap to allow for cognitive processing before the behavioral reaction.
That is a fascinating way to view it. Latency isn't just about compliance. It's about the buffer zone between the environment and the reaction.
Exactly.
Now let's look at the other side of the temporal locus coin, interresponse time, or IRT.
If latency is the gap between the environment and the behavior, IRT is the gap between two identical behaviors.
Between two identical behaviors.
Okay, the strict definition is the amount of time that elapses between the end of one response and the beginning of the next consecutive response of the same response class.
So the behavior happens, it ends, the clock starts, the void begins, the behavior starts again, the clock stops. The void is the IRT.
That's a very poetic way to phrase it, but yes.
Let's look at a clinical application. You have a client who engages in severe pica, which is the ingestion of non-edible items, like swollen coins or pieces of plastic.
Very dangerous.
Very dangerous. They do this rapidly during unstructured time. How does IRT apply here?
You would measure the time between the moment they swallow one item and the moment they reach for the next item. If they swallow a piece of plastic and then 4 seconds later they reach for another one, your IRT is 4 seconds.
And measuring that void is critical because of how it dictates the overall density of the behavior. Which brings up one of the most notoriously confusing concepts for RBT candidates, the mathematical relationship between IRT and rate.
It is an inverse relationship, and it fundamentally breaks people's intuition until they visualize it.
Let's visualize it. If I have a behavioral goal to decrease the rate of a client's pica, what do I logically need to do to the IRT?
You need to increase the IRT. You need to stretch out that void.
Right.
If the client is currently eating a piece of plastic every 4 seconds, their rate is astronomically high. If you implement an intervention that stretches that gap out, so now they are waiting 45 minutes between attempts, the IRT has gone up, which means the overall rate of the behavior across the day has plummeted.
I see. So longer IRTs equal lower rates, shorter IRTs equal higher rates.
Exactly. And this is the mechanical foundation of a specific reinforcement schedule called DRL, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior.
Let's unpack the mechanics of a DRL schedule. How does manipulating the IRT actually change the brain's pacing?
Let's use a more benign example, rapid eating. A client eats their lunch so fast they are at risk of choking. The behavior isn't inherently bad, eating is necessary, but the rate is dangerously high.
So we need them to slow down.
The BCBA designs a DRL schedule. The RBT sits with the client and a timer. The client takes a bite. The RBT starts a 15-second timer. The rule is the client only accesses reinforcement, perhaps praise, or access to a highly preferred drink if they wait the full 15 seconds before taking the next bite.
So if they reach for a bite at 10 seconds, what happens?
The RBT blocks access to the bite, provides no reinforcement, and the timer resets.
Oh, wow. So they have to start the waiting all over again.
Yes. The client quickly learns that a short IRT yields nothing. But stretching their patience, enduring that 15-second void, yields a massive payoff.
They get the drink.
Over time, their internal pacing adjusts. They naturally adopt a longer IRT, which organically lowers the rate of eating to a safe, sustainable level.
That is the elegance of behavior analysis right there.
Yeah.
You aren't just telling them to slow down. You are mechanically restructuring the temporal spacing of their environment.
It's powerful when done correctly.
Let's lock this in with a final thought experiment for the listeners. Picture this sequence occurring in a clinic room. You, the RBT, place a math worksheet on the desk and say, "Start working."
Okay.
You start your timer. 8 seconds pass, and the client picks up the pencil. You record the 8 seconds.
Got it.
Later in the session, the client begins clapping their hands repeatedly in a stereotypy loop. You start a timer the moment they stop clapping, and you stop the timer the moment they start clapping again. You record 14 seconds. Which two temporal dimensions did you just measure in chronological order?
The first measurement captured the void between an instruction and the initiation of a response. That is latency.
Right.
The second measurement captured the void between the end of one response and the start of the next identical response. That is interresponse time.
Latency, followed by IRT. Master those two, and you master the temporal locus of behavior. Now, understanding the theory and passing a multiple-choice exam is one hurdle. But executing this on the floor of a chaotic clinic, or in a noisy classroom, or during an RBT recertification competency assessment requires a completely different set of skills.
Oh, definitely. The competency assessment is where theory meets reality. If you look at the BACB's assessment document, the very first tasks are exclusively dedicated to measurement.
You can't even get to the interventions without passing measurement.
You cannot even practice as an RBT unless you can demonstrate in real time, either with a live client or in a rigorous role play, that you can accurately capture frequency, duration, latency, and IRT.
So as someone who has likely supervised countless RBTs, what is the failure point? Where do smart, capable people mess up the continuous measurement in practice?
The most profound failure point doesn't actually happen during the measurement itself. It happens before the session even starts.
Really, before the session starts?
Yes. The RBT fails to secure a watertight operational definition from the BCBA.
What does a porous, poorly written definition look like, and how does it ruin the data?
A poor definition relies on internal states or subjective adjectives. If a behavior plan says, track instances of Johnny acting defiant, that is a disaster.
Why? Because defiant is open to interpretation.
Exactly. Defiant is a construct. It doesn't physically exist in space and time. If you have 3 different RBTs working with Johnny, RBT number 1 might think defiant means rolling his eyes. RBT number 2 might think it means sighing heavily. RBT number 3 might think it only counts if he verbally refuses a task.
So you have 3 different technicians taking data on 3 completely different topographies of behavior, all funneling into the exact same graph.
And the graph becomes meaningless noise. You cannot measure quality. You can only measure defined, observable actions.
So the RBT has to advocate for themselves.
The RBT must demand clarity. Quality of behavior cannot be assessed unless defined. A watertight definition sounds like this. Noncompliance is defined as failing to initiate a motor or vocal response within 5 seconds of an initial SD, or engaging in a physical action that is incompatible with the demand.
That is objective. I can see it. I can start a stopwatch for it.
Exactly. No guesswork.
But even with a perfect definition, human beings are flawed instruments of measurement. Which brings us to a phenomenon I find psychologically fascinating and deeply dangerous for clinical data. Observer drift.
Observer drift is perhaps the most insidious threat to data integrity because it happens completely subconsciously.
It's covered in the Tupper text, right?
Yes. The Cooper text defines observer drift as an unintended change in the way an observer uses a measurement system over the course of an investigation.
Unpack the psychology of that. Why does an RBT's measurement drift if the definition on the paper never changed?
It drifts because humans adapt to their environments and we build emotional connections. Let's say the operational definition for aggression is any instance of open-handed contact with another person's body delivered with force.
Okay, pretty clear.
On week 1, you are hypervigilant. The client lightly swats your arm because they are frustrated, and you mark it down. Frequency, 1.
You are strictly adhering to the letter of the law.
But fast forward 3 months. You have spent hundreds of hours with this client. You know their family, you know their triggers, you have built immense rapport.
You care about them.
The client is having a tough day, they get frustrated, and they lightly swat your arm again. Because you know them so well, your brain immediately rationalizes it. Oh, he didn't really mean that, he's just tired. That wasn't a real hit, I'm not going to count that.
Your internal threshold for what constitutes the behavior has completely shifted because of empathy and context.
Exactly. And while empathy is a wonderful human trait, it is a catastrophic variable in objective measurement. Over time, without realizing it, you have rewritten the operational definition in your own mind.
You're not using the paper definition anymore.
You are no longer measuring open-handed contact. You are measuring open-handed contact that I personally feel was delivered with malicious intent.
And the downstream effect of that is that the data graph shows a steady decline in aggression over those 3 months. The BCBA looks at the graph and says, incredible. The intervention is working perfectly. The aggression is fading.
But in reality, the aggression never changed at all. The only thing that faded was your objectivity.
That is the chilling reality of observer drift. It creates false positives for treatment success. And it can also work in reverse.
Right, absolutely.
If an RBT is experiencing severe burnout, their tolerance might drop. A behavior that didn't meet the criteria in week 1 might start getting tallied in week 12 because the RBT is just exhausted and everything feels like a severe behavior.
That's very common too.
So how does an RBT inoculate themselves against that? I mean, you can't just turn off your humanity.
You combat it through constant, rigorous calibration. You don't trust your memory of the definition. You read the definition verbatim before every single session.
Like a pilot doing a pre-flight checklist.
Exactly. And you ask for overlapping supervision, where the BCBA takes data simultaneously with you to check your interobserver agreement, your IOA. If your data says the frequency was 12 and the BCBA's data says the frequency was 4, you know instantly that one of you has drifted.
It requires a profound level of humility to admit that your perception might be flawed.
It does.
But that humility is what protects the client. So what does this all mean? When we talk about continuous measurement, whether we are counting the frequency of a thrown object, dividing it by time to find the true rate, tracking the agonizing duration of a tantrum, measuring the delayed latency of a response, or stretching out the IRT to slow behavior down, we are ultimately engaging in an act of translation.
I love that. Translation.
We are translating the chaotic, messy reality of human behavior into a language of numbers that can be analyzed and improved.
That is a beautiful synthesis. Data is the only voice the behavior truly has. If you fail to measure it accurately, you silence that voice. You rob the client of the opportunity to have their environment adapted to their actual needs rather than what you assume their needs are.
I want to end on that note, and I want to challenge everyone listening to turn this inward. Next time you step into a clinic room or a classroom or an in-home session, I want you to mentally audit your own objectivity. Look at the data sheet in your hand. Ask yourself, am I measuring this behavior exactly as it was defined on day one? Or have I let my exhaustion, my affection for the client, or my assumption about what the BCBA wants to see slowly warp my perspective?
It's a question you have to ask yourself constantly.
Remember, the vitals you are taking are only as good as your willingness to see the unvarnished truth. The moment you start seeing what you want to see, you become that reckless doctor prescribing interventions without checking the pulse.
Very well said.
This is Behavioral Intelligence con Sanchez, proudly brought to you by Amethyst Therapy Services. If this episode helped you become a stronger RBT, follow the podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with another RBT, parent, or future clinician. Every share helps someone discover evidence-based knowledge that can change lives. Be proud of sharing things with value.